we were thinking a lot about horror movies when we were writing it, because the premise of couples going on a vacation to a cabin in the woods is the premise of many, many horror films, including the Evil Dead movies. So, in a way, we were making a horror movie where the horror wasn't physical; it's emotional. It's a film about people going to a cabin in the woods where nobody dies, but still, there's something about the lighting in the bar at the end, which is just everything is kind of tinted blood red, which I think kind of underscores the emotional horror of what Peggy is describing in that particular scene. There are a lot of films about people going on vacation and about the vacation being, less than relaxing for the participants. But I wasn't really thinking consciously of trying to make a film within that genre. It was really, for me, more about taking the characters out of an urban environment and putting them into a rural environment and taking them away from their ordinary lives, their work lives, away from the stresses of their daily routines. And it was really about having them face one another without really having anything to do. And that, to me, was the catalyst for all of the tensions and all of the problems that existed in their lives, which they would typically be able to kind of keep swept under the rug. The fact that they have nothing to do is what allows those things to come to the surface. So my first feature, Cool Apocalypse, came out when I was 39 years old. And it was really very expensive to make movies when I graduated from film school. When I was in film school in the late 90s and early 2000s, when I was in my 20s, you had to shoot on film. Everything was shot on 16 millimeter, and you had to pay for the film. You had to pay to have the film developed, and you had to rent equipment. So it was very expensive and resource heavy. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s that digital production sort of became the norm for indie features. So once the cost came down, I sort of decided to take another crack at it. And I've been, pretty prolific ever since. I've made 4 feature films between 2015 and 2022. And I just finished a short film, and hopefully I'll be making another feature within the next year. Mercury in Retrograde was always the title for this particular story. And I thought that it was indirect in the sense that when I wrote the first draft in 2015, a lot of people didn't know what Mercury in Retrograde meant. It's an astrological phenomenon that I think has become a lot more popular in the cultural consciousness since the film came out. And so I think it seems a little bit more direct now. But the phenomenon of Mercury in retrograde is where the planet Mercury, which rules communication, according to those who believe in astrology, it appears to be going backwards. So it's a time when communication supposedly becomes tangled. And for me, miscommunication was really the theme of the film. So in a lot of ways, this film, Mercury in Retrograde, is a continuation of my first feature, Cool Apocalypse. They're both about relationships, and they're both about communication. And I really felt like that was a subject about which I had more to say. To a certain extent, I felt like the subject matter was not done with me. My first film takes place in Chicago, where I live, and I didn't want to set the second movie here because I thought in a lot of ways it would be too similar. So I thought that by making a film about couples who go on vacation together to a cabin in the woods, which is very different from the urban setting of my first film, I thought that would sort of illuminate the theme of the film in a way that would feel fresh. I basically got that idea of the horoscopes opening the film from Agnes Varda's film Cleo from 5 to 7, which begins with a scene where the protagonist visits a psychic who reads her tarot cards. And everything that the psychic reads in the cards basically comes true over the course of the film. And that's exactly what happens in Mercury in Retrograde. Personally, I think that horoscopes are bullshit. I don't believe in them at all. However, if I ever do look at the horoscopes in the newspaper or whatever, I only read my own and nobody else's. So what does that tell you? The role of Peggy was very difficult to cast because I do feel like Peggy is the heart of the film, and she would be even without the narration at the beginning and the end. I happened to see a movie called Contracted, which is a horror movie about a young woman who is date raped and contracts an STI that turns her into a zombie. And the actress in that film was Najara Townsend. And I saw it on the big screen, and the whole movie, I was blown away by her performance because, to be honest with you, it's kind of a silly movie, but her acting was phenomenal. She was so sincere, in spite of the outrageous premise, that I really was just found her very, very, very compelling. But she also had she had that quality that I was looking for, which is really a kind of toughness mixed with vulnerability and a suggestion that there's something going on under the surface. And so it had to be somebody who I think suggested that they had a kind of rich inner life, but who would be, really compelling to watch while keeping all of that repressed until the very, very, final act of the film. Everything you've seen in the film is sort of being filtered through her memories of the event. So she's an authorial presence in the sense that she's the one who's remembering what you see. And even the events that she's not witness to, you feel like are somehow colored by her impression of what happened that weekend. And I wanted to make that obvious in the beginning. There's a little bit of voiceover in the beginning, and then there's a little bit at the end. And in the beginning, she talks about memory. She says, it's lonely being the only one who remembers. That happens to be a very personal line to me because I do have an excellent memory. And I will oftentimes say to people, friends and family and my wife, I'll say, do you remember when, such and such a thing happened? And oftentimes the person I'm talking to will say no. They'll have no memory of something that I know they were there for. And I almost feel like, God, it didn't happen if you don't remember it as well as I do. I had seen Henry Gamble's Birthday Party, a great Chicago-made indie by Stephen Cohn. And that film, I thought, used the 2:3:5 aspect ratio really effectively because it has a large ensemble cast. And so I hired the cinematographer for that film, Jason Chu, to shoot Mercury, knowing that we were going to have, there were going to be a lot of scenes where there were 6 people on screen at the same time. I knew I wanted to use long takes, and I didn't want to do a lot of cutting. So there was going to be a lot of kind of slow camera movements where we would kind of either dolly or pan from character to character in order to direct the eye of the viewer. I had less rehearsal time on this particular film than I've had on any of my films. This was really the only film I've made where we did not do a table read in advance. But I think all of the actors had to bond really, really quickly. And they did. They spent a lot of time with each other, socializing. And it began as soon as, we started shooting. The actors would hang out together at night. They'd go into town. They'd go into a bar, in Grand Rapids, which is where they were all staying. And they spent a lot of time together. And I think among the guys, you can feel a lot of camaraderie during the book club scene. There was also a fair amount of improvisation during that particular scene. And I think it works as well as it does because we scheduled it last. Well, the book club scene was really the impetus I had to create this movie to begin with. I wanted to make a movie about 3 couples and how they sort of become segregated along gender lines once they're on vacation together. And I thought it would be really provocative to use parallel editing to cut back and forth between, the 3 guys and the three women, and to sort of draw a contrast between how the men communicate versus how the women communicate. And I feel like it's pretty common for men to feel the need to have some sort of activity if they want to hang out with one another. And to be totally honest with you, I was in a book club with 2 other guys at the time I, wrote the screenplay. My wife would go hang out with the other wives and girlfriends while we were having our book club. And, she would sometimes come home and say, "Oh, what did you guys talk about?" And I would say, "Well, we talked about the book." And she would say, "Oh, well, we talked about," and she would say, that they would talk about things that were intensely personal. When they decide to go into the bar, it's kind of like, well, what do you guys want to do? Well, let's have our own book club, But since they haven't read a book, they're completely improvising, and they're basically reciting their favorite poems, or in Golda's case, her favorite song lyrics. And I think that's, again, based on, something that I've observed. I do think that when women analyze art, they're more likely to just be honest about how it hits them on an emotional level, right? Whereas I do think men tend to care more about intellectualizing it. Part of what I was trying to get across was the idea that oftentimes when relationships go wrong, whether it's a romance or a friendship, you're oftentimes not aware of the, critical moment where things go wrong when it's happening. It's oftentimes only in retrospect that you look back and you think, oh, that particular book club, it didn't go the way that I think we all hoped that it would. We didn't bond the way that we were supposed to. And it wasn't until later on, it's almost like an unconscious thing. And it wasn't until later on that you realized, oh, that was the beginning of the end.
Good morning.
Whoa.
You must be my guests.
Yeah, it was amazing working with Andrew Sensenig. And I wanted to cast an actor in that role because I knew it was limited screen time, but somebody who would make a big impression. And of course, he and Jack both do have the curly hair. They do look alike. So that was a nice coincidence. Jack Newell, who plays Jack Jr., really bonded quickly with Andrew. He told me he developed kind of a creative crush on Andrew during the one day where Andrew was on set. The thing I really liked about that scene is there's a shot early on where Jack Jr. is on his phone. He's like scrolling through his phone and he's not paying attention to what his dad is saying at all. And I thought that was really funny because all of his friends, of course, are listening to Jack Sr. with rapt attention as he's, because Jack Jr.'s already heard it all, right? Like that's his dad. He doesn't need to pay attention. And in a lot of ways, that was really the beginning of Relative, my most recent feature, because Relative is all about parent-child relationships. And the only time I had explored that prior to Relative was that one brief scene with Andrew Sensenig. The most important thing that I learned making Mercury in Retrograde is to find joy in the process of making a film, because that was honestly the most difficult experience I've ever had making a movie, and it was the least fun. And I'm very proud of the film. It ended up being what I wanted it to be, but I put a lot of pressure on myself during the making of the film because it was a huge step up in terms of budget. And therefore, I felt like the film needed to be successful. And I think this is a trap that a lot of independent filmmakers fall into, because filmmaking is expensive, because it's resource heavy. It's difficult to feel free, I think, in the way that a painter or a poet can feel free when creating. But I think the pressure that I was feeling, I was putting it on myself, and the film we had a very hard time getting the film finished due to financial, difficulties. And it didn't end up doing what I wanted it to do. I thought we deserved to have a really great festival run. But as Clint Eastwood says in Unforgiven, deserves got nothing to do with it, And there was a period towards the end of post-production on Mercury where I actually told everyone I was never gonna make another film again because it was too hard, and that lasted for about 5 minutes. And then I said, no, what I need to do is make another movie right away, and to do it quickly and cheaply, and to make sure that I premiere very, very, very soon after we're done with post-production, to go through post as quickly as possible and to just have fun, And so that was Rendezvous in Chicago. We made it on a very low budget. We shot the whole thing in a week, and we premiered 5 months after we wrapped shooting. And that movie, in a way, saved my life. It certainly saved my career, because when I was done, I thought, I just want to keep doing this. I want to keep doing it, and I want to feel good about what I do, and I want to have fun, and I want this to be a positive experience for the people who are working with me. And so when I made Relative, that was a step up in budget, but I was really very relaxed during the production of Relative. And that is something that translated to the cast and the crew. Everybody on that film had a good time. Everybody was relaxed because they could tell that I was relaxed. So that's something that that I hope to continue with all of my future films.